I'm Bob Woodworth. I want to thank you for purchasing the Pooping Puppy Candy Dispenser pattern. This little guy right here. I think you're going to have fun with it. I think you're going to enjoy making it. I think it's going to please a lot of people once they see it. So anyway, the first thing we're going to need to do is get your pattern printed out properly. I have in the written instructions a detailed explanation as to how you need to actually print this pattern out, to all the things you need to check to make sure that it's right, because let's face it, none of us like waste ink and paper. I also have a little blip in here at the end of this little section of the video that will also explain it. So between watching the video, reading the written instructions, you shouldn't have a problem with printing out your pattern. Just a couple things on the puppy. The overall dimensions from nose to tail is about 9 inches. It stands about 7.5 inches tall and is about 2 1/4, 2.5 inches thick that way. Also, the candy that we need to use is the M&M style. You know, Skittles, M&Ms, they're basically both small, round candies that work very well on this. The bigger ones just don't work so much, and soft candies don't work because they tend to melt and get stuck together and they just won't feed out. So you need a hard candy for this to work properly. Okay, so now it's time to get started. I really hope you have fun with this. I think you will. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at bob.uwt@gmail.com. It's right here. And as soon as I get your email, I will respond as quickly as possible. So let's get to it, and let's start building our puppy.
Now that you've received your pattern and you're probably all excited to get started on your little puppy, first thing we need to do is print it out properly. This is a big pattern. It's a total of 17 pages. You do not need to print all of them. All you need to do is print pages 6 through 12 for the pattern itself. If after reviewing it and you want to print out the written instructions as well, then just print out pages 6 through 17. Don't worry, it might sound a little complicated, but I'm going to show you how to do it right now. When you opened your link, the first thing you saw for the pattern is this page. And if you'll notice up here, it can open up at any size on your computer. So the first thing we want to do is highlight our little box here and come down to 100%. Change the size to 100%. You'll notice over here is total of 17 pages. If you want to look at each page individually, click the down arrow here and it will take you through all of the pages. Or you could simply use the slider bar over here and do the same thing. Okay, now that we're set at 100%, we can go ahead and print now. We come over here to our little printer icon, and if you click it too many times, you'll get a little beep like I just did. And this page will pop up. The first thing we need to do is check to make sure that this is set to the printer that you want to print your pattern at. If you only have one printer hooked up, it shouldn't be a problem. This only matters if you have multiple printers. Next thing we want to do is make sure this is set to 1, the copies. You only need 1 copy of it. You shouldn't need any more than that. Okay, now we come down to pages to print, and we want to come down here. This is important. This is where we print the pages that we want to print. I only want to print the pattern itself. I'm not concerned about printing the written instructions right now. So I'm going to type in here 6-12. By doing that, we will only print pages 6 through 12. My size button is already highlighted, so that's good. Actual size is already highlighted. If this is on anything other than actual size, you want to click this and change it to actual size. The other thing that's very important is we need this to print out on landscape, but if you click the auto portrait landscape, it'll print it out as landscape. If you want to print the written instructions out, you also want to have it here because the written instructions are laid out portrait style, so it'll automatically print them out as portrait and print the pattern out at landscape at the same time. And then all we do is we come over here and click our print button, and your pattern is ready to print. It's pretty much that simple, but this procedure is important. I don't want you wasting any more paper or ink than you need to, so if you follow these directions, it'll print out the way you need it to print out. Now that you have your pattern properly printed, I want to go over it for a little bit. It's a little bit different than your typical scroll saw pattern in the fact that it is not only a pattern that you would just typically cut out, rip off, and throw away. This pattern is also a template for piece layout and drill guides. So it's important that you understand what the pattern is first, and also the important parts of it and how we're going to use it. This first page shows you a bunch of different colors on it. All these colors actually do have meaning. Each color represents a specific part of the pattern. The red part you see here represents the two sides, each half of either side of the dog. You'll have a right half and a left half. The blue represents the moving parts of the pattern. Anything that's blue is something that will actually is mechanical and will move inside the dog itself, the internal part, the internal moving parts. The purple represents the stationary parts that are the guts basically of the dog. You know, without the guts it won't work. And it's important that these are cut properly and laid out properly. The green parts represent everything that's external to the dog. We're talking about the ears, the nose, the legs, and the little cover that covers up the feed hole for you to put the M&Ms or whatever candy you're using into the dog. I'm going to go over each section individually because they all have their own little quirks. The red section entails 2 pages. It has each half on a separate page. R1 here is the part number for the right half of the dog. And what I mean by right half is when you're looking at the dog face on, like you're looking directly at its nose, it's the right half of the dog. R2 is the left half of the dog. The R1 pieces are main building block. It's the piece that we're going to use to set everything up. This is the piece we're going to work with first, even though we'll cut all the pieces out so that we have them done and we don't have to stop and cut each piece individually. Any of the dotted lines do not get cut out. They are there for visual reference for when we go to lay the other pieces on top of this. As you can see, I've got the drill holes all laid out for you, so all you need to do is pick your drill bits and drill the holes. There is a difference in the holes though. The green hole, and this is consistent throughout the pattern, the green holes get cut all the way through, completely through the wood that you're using, be it 1/4 inch or 3/8. The red holes only go halfway or at most 3/4 of the way through the thickness of the wood. That's so that we don't have the dowel showing through on the opposite side of the wood, which would be visible for people. We don't want people to see the dowels. It's very important that when we apply the pattern to our 2 pieces of wood for the sides, especially R1, that we tape the wood first before we put the pattern on. I know a lot of you probably do it the other way around where you glue the pattern onto the wood and then put tape over it. Well, in this case, that won't work very well. It's going to be extremely difficult to finish this project with the pattern glued to the wood as opposed to being glued to tape. The tape will end up later on being easier to take off. This pattern is going to be on your piece of wood for a while. The next section is the purple section. These are all the stationary internal parts. If you'll notice on the purple section, I've also got some red lines that go around the inside of the pattern. Those are visual guides for that when you're actually cutting these pieces out, these are the areas that you need to be really careful on. You cut slowly, you take your time, and you be as accurate as you possibly can to stay on the line, because these are very critical to the operation of the internal parts moving properly. If these aren't right, it's going to be a lot more difficult to make sure that your puppy works properly. And as you can see, the parts are individually numbered P1, P2, and P3. The P obviously stands for purple. At this point, the blue layer is pretty much self-explanatory. Same thing, we've got the drill hole guides with the different size drills that we need. There is a reason for these particular drills, and I'll get into that a little later. As you can see, we also have our red critical lines here that you need to pay attention to these particular areas really closely when you're cutting it out. The B3 plunger piece is intentionally longer than it needs to be. We'll determine the actual length it needs to be later on in the process, and then this piece will be cut off as waste. The final layer is the green layer. The only thing that's at issue with this layer is that all these holes are only cut half to 3/4 of the way through the wood because they are external parts. We don't want to see the dowel sticking out of the legs or the cover. Hopefully this montage of colors will now make a little bit more sense to you. We're ready to start moving forward, so let's get to the nuts and bolts of actually starting to make this project and make our puppy poop.
The first thing we need to talk about is the woods we're going to use. We have varying sizes. This pile here is 3/4 inch, this is 1/2 inch, and these are 1/4 inch. I'm using oak. These three pieces are oak, walnut, and a little piece of wenge here, which will be for the nose. I also have a piece of 3/16 inch dowel, which is poplar. Oak dowel would be fine too. Any kind of dowel you can get would work fine. You can use any variety of wood you would like. I just use these because this is what I have on hand. That doesn't mean you have to make it the same way. You can use your imagination and use whatever variety of wood you would like to use. Before applying the pattern to any of these, the first thing I'm going to do is sand all this down to 220. So that way I don't have to worry about trying to do it later. We will be doing some sanding in the end. It's nice to have everything prepped ahead of time and sanded down. The pattern goes on much better that way too, which is what we'll do next. We'll start applying the patterns. Before we actually start applying the pattern, there is one piece of wood that needs a little bit of special attention. The section that it has all the moving internal parts on it, the head and the tail, parts B1 through B4, it needs to be a little bit thinner than the stationary internal parts. So if you're fortunate enough to have a wood planer, the 3/4 inch piece of wood that you're going to apply the blue section parts to, you need to plane that down to 5/8 of an inch. If you don't have a planer, go ahead and cut the pieces out and we'll just sand them down later individually. That's what I'll have to do because I'm one of those that aren't fortunate enough to have a wood planer. Once the wood's planed down, you can go ahead and apply the pattern like I'm going to show. And again, if you don't have a wood planer, don't worry about it. Go ahead and apply the pattern. Now that I've got all the pieces of wood sanded, I went ahead and cut out all the pattern pieces so I can preliminarily lay them down on the pattern to get an idea of how I'm going to cut these out and the grain direction. Over here with the legs, the grain direction is all vertical. That'll give the legs extra strength and they'll all look uniform. We don't want the grain going horizontal on one or two legs and the other legs, the grain going vertical. It just wouldn't look right. Over here, these pieces, it's important to have the long grain going with the pattern this way, and the dog's head. Just for the dog's head, strictly for aesthetics, I think it'll look better that way. But these, the long grain will give these pieces extra strength, and they need them. There's one more grain direction issue we need to deal with, and I wanted to zoom it in so you guys could see it a little closer. Part number G8 goes over the feed hole on part number R2, like this. So when we cut this out, we want to make sure that the grain direction stays the same on both patterns, because when you put the cover on, it will look silly if the grain doesn't match up. So we just want to make sure that these holes are pretty much the same bring the pattern over here and then glue the pattern down and go ahead and cut it out. Now I'm going to tape up all my pieces. I'm going to put blue tape down first, and then I'm going to glue the pattern on top of the tape. Again, I said this before, but that's very important because it will make pattern removal much easier later on as we build the project. Now that the patterns are all applied, before I cut these, it's going to be much easier to drill all these little holes as they are now. So I'm going to take this over to the drill press, drill all the holes according to the guides. The reds are half to 3/4 of the way through, the greens are all the way through. So I'll drill all these out, and after I'm done drilling them, then I'm going to take everything over to the scroll saw and cut it out ahead of time. Just about all the drilling we're going to be doing is related to the dowel. There is one hole where we need a Forstner bit, or if you don't have a Forstner bit, a regular drill bit. It's going to be a through hole for the candy feed. That's the only place we'll use a Forstner bit or a regular bit. If you don't have a 7/8 inch Forstner bit like this is, you can go ahead and make the hole 3/4. It'll still work. It's just a little bit tighter. The dowel I'm using for this project is a 3/16 inch dowel. Basically, I picked that because that's what I had on hand. I had 1/4 inch, but the 3/16 inch dowel seemed to work better. And I also tried 1/8 inch, but the 1/8 inch is just too small and too weak. You really can't use the 1/8 inch dowel. So the 3/16 seems to work really well. The problem is, if I wanted to use just a 3/16 inch bit to drill the hole, it makes it really hard to get the dowel through the 3/16 inch hole. So I decided to go up a 1/64 of an inch, and that's where the 17/64 inch bit comes into play. The dowel will still fit in the hole nice and snug, but it's a lot easier to get in the hole using the 17/64 bit. The 7/32 bit is another 1/64 bigger, which is used strictly for our moving parts. As you can see here, we have a couple different areas. There's one on the tail like this also, where you need to have free movement, where the parts can move without any restriction. And the 7/32 inch bit works very well on that. If you don't have it 7/32, you could probably even get away with a 1/4, but that might be pushing a little bit. You're better off using a drill bit a little bit smaller than a 1/4. If you simply cannot find or do not have a 3/16 inch dowel, you can use a 1/4 inch dowel instead. You just be aware that you'll need to upsize your bits a little bit, you know, a couple 64ths above the 1/4 inch that you need to make the dowels go in the holes properly. When you're actually drilling the holes, make sure you have a good piece of wood behind it so that when you drill the through holes all the way through, the wood won't splinter on the back. As for the scroll saw blades, I typically use most of the time a number 3 or a number 5 for cutting 3/4 inch wood. But for you use whatever you're comfortable with. I mean, there's nothing really special about cutting the wood. It's just cut the wood out and then we'll start putting the pieces together. So use whatever blade you're comfortable with. As for the actual cutting out of the pieces, just remember the red lines. You got to be really careful. Take your time, go slow, stay on the line as best as you possibly can. Now I'm going to go ahead and drill everything and cut everything out. Now that all the pieces are cut out, it's time to start assembly. So we're going to ignore all these for now and concentrate strictly on R1. R1 is our base plate. This is where we're going to build everything off. So this is our most important piece at this point. The first thing we're going to need to do is
follow the dotted lines with an X-Acto knife, or I'm using basically what's a fancy box cutter. We're going to cut all these lines out, and then we're going to pull this piece of pattern off all the way through here. We're going to do the same thing with this piece and also with the tail piece. This is where having the pattern on top of the tape is beneficial, because once I cut these out, now I'll be able to pull this pattern off and the tape at the same time, leaving the rest of this here, because we're going to need all this here in order to set the pieces back in as a guide. The reason for cutting it out is because when we bring these pieces in, we're going to need something to line these edges up to. We're also going to glue them down at the same time, so you can't glue the wood here to the paper pattern. So we cut this out. We still have our guide here, the outline of our guide, and we'll be able to glue wood to wood as opposed to wood to paper. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all these lines out, and when I come back you'll see how I progressed. That's not so bad to do. It's just like anything else, you take your time, you do it right, and as you can see, now we have guides so that when we're ready to glue these parts down, we'll know exactly where to put them. This is a mechanical device. It's not just your typical little fretwork. It's important for these pieces to be lined up exactly in the right spot, otherwise you're going to have a real hard time making your little puppy poop properly. You might get constipated or worse. Now what we need to do is get our dowels in place. And we're going to do that by cutting the dowels a little bit longer than they need to be. We can always sand them down when we need to. We're going to do the actual size method. And we'll slide our head down, and we'll just place our other piece up here real quick to get a general idea where it needs to go. Now that the dowel's marked, I'm going to go ahead and cut it to length real quick. If you're wondering how I cut the dowel, I simply cut it on the scroll saw. Now we've got the dowel in place, we'll slide the head on top, and we'll basically do the same process for the back. The back's just a hair different because the hole does go all the way through, so we'll slide the tail on, slide the butt piece on, and give it a quick little mark. Pull it out, take it apart. So you can see, even with the 13/64 inch hole, which is just a hair larger than the 3/16 inch dowel, it's still a really snug fit to get in there. So that's the reasoning why using a 3/16 inch bit to drill the holes would even be more difficult. I'll be right back. I'm going to cut this dowel. Okay, the tail dowel is cut. Stick it in there. We'll throw the tail on. Okay, now we've got the two rubber band dowels left. Both of these dowels I'm going to mark with this one, and I'll cut the other one to be exactly the same, but I'm going to come about 1/4 of an inch just below the dog's head and put a little mark here. And I'll go ahead and cut two of those the exact same length. Both of these are to hold the rubber band. The reason they're lower is so that you can get the rubber band on easily and also close the lid without any problems. Alright, now the dowels are cut. They actually are right at 3/4 of an inch, so if you just cut them at 3/4 of an inch, you probably will be good to go, even if your hole is not quite, your hole in the R1 piece is not exactly consistent. Alright, so now all I'm going to do is put a little dab of glue into each one of the holes. I don't think you need to watch that.
I'm going to install each dowel, let it dry for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and go from there. At this point, we're ready to install and glue down parts P1 and P2. But before we do that, we're going to do a little preventive work here in order to make sure that our candy feeds properly. I have found that even with the hardwood, the candy will tend to hang up on the ramp here and in this area here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some 220 grit sandpaper, carefully sand these areas down, this area here, this area here, and the ramp right here coming up and going down. The next thing we're going to do to really make sure that the candy feeds right, because that is the biggest problem with these, they tend to get hung up sometimes. I'm going to take these and spray some lacquer on these inside areas, this area here, and on this area here. Once the lacquer is completely cured, which, you know, within 24-48 hours, it's food safe, so it's a perfect application for this. I went ahead and sprayed the lacquer on these pieces. It's all done now. Just a couple things of note. After spraying the lacquer on, just take a piece of brown paper bag and buff it up real good, especially on the ramp and in here, and again on the lower ramp. It really makes it nice and smooth and slick as a baby's bottom. I just wanted to also show you that I hadn't done this before, and I should have. That's my bad. I went ahead and drilled these two holes here. These are the holes for the left half cover to go on. We're going to need to put a couple screws in there, and it's really critical to pre-drill these holes. I used an 1/8 inch drill bit, simply because this is pretty fragile wood here, and we don't want it to crack just by simply putting the screw in. So I went ahead and did that because we can go ahead and take some of these patterns off now. As a matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and take this one off. As you can see with the tape on there, just really, once you get it started, it peels right off without a problem. And I'll go ahead and do the other two pieces too. Now we're ready to glue up. For the glue up, I'm simply just going to use some Type-On 2, nothing special. Any wood glue will pretty much work. That just happens to be what I have. I went ahead and applied some glue. We're just simply going to drop these on, and this is where the template comes in handy and is very important that we get this as close to perfect as we possibly can. That piece looks good. I'll get the bottom piece, set it on there. Get our butt piece. Okay, I'm just going to grab some little spring clamps, clamp it up, and let it sit for 20 minutes, and then we can start with the rest of it. And here we are, all clamped up. While we're waiting for this glue to dry, we've got some work to do on the moving parts. These are all our blue moving parts. We have B1, B2, B3, and B4. We do need to do some adjustments to the cuts we've already made in order for all this to work.
If you were unable to plane these pieces down earlier, now would be the time to take them over to a belt sander or use a random orbit sander and take about 1/8 of an inch off the back side of them. This will prevent binding when you put the cover on, so it needs to be just below the stationary parts.
The first thing we're going to do is take piece number B2. I've already done it. I took a ruler, marked 1/4 of an inch here and 1/4 of an inch here, and then drew a line across them. Now what I'm going to do is simply cut down that line on the scroll saw. Okay, there's the result. This piece now is no longer needed, so we'll just set that aside. All we wanted was the piece that was 1/4 of an inch thick. Now this is going to go in here like this, and the dowel will run through this way. So what we need to do is get a ballpark here. You put the piece of wood on top of the tail piece of the head and just mark it. Give yourself a couple little marks. Go up past the hole. Make sure you're past the hole by a good little distance. I mean, this isn't the most accurate of work here, but it's really hard to try to make a pattern work for this. So we'll just have to do something by hand here. So we're going to do that there. I also need to do it on piece B3 because the connecting rod is going to go between these two pieces. So we'll do the same thing here real quick. Now I'm just going to take these two pieces and cut these notches out on the scroll saw. Okay, here's our two notches now. You just want to make sure that your connecting rod is going to fit in between them without a problem. It doesn't matter if there's slop in there. It's not going to hurt it at all. Okay, so now the next thing we do is we take our piece of dowel, run the dowel through these two holes. Give us a little bit like that. We'll mark the dowel. Flip the dowel over. We've got to do this twice on the same thickness of wood, so it doesn't matter that I'm using the one piece. Got the two marks on the dowel. I'll go cut those out and have two pieces of dowel when I come back. Alright, now that we have everything is ready to go. This is, pretty straightforward. We simply take our dowel, run it through one half, make sure it goes through the middle of the connecting rod, out the other side. If you want to put a dab of glue here on both sides, feel free. And we do the same thing to the other side. And now we have our plunger assembly. Just make sure that you got full movement all the way through. I'm sure you've noticed this little piece of waste, this little word I got, waste, written here. This is here strictly because once the glue is dry, we can put this piece in and then get an exact measurement as to where this is going to be, where it's going to end up. Then at that point we'll mark it and cut this piece off. Another thing we can do while we're waiting for the glue to dry is I put a little mark just past the plunger piece, a little circle there right in the middle of the piece of wood, for a drill hole. We're going to go use our 1/8 inch drill bit and drill a hole through that piece because that's where the rubber band will feed through. And there you have it. We have our rubber band through the middle of our connecting rod. I'm sure you noticed I also took the liberty of peeling the rest of the pattern off of the plunger and the dog's head because it was no longer needed. While we're waiting, I'm just going to go ahead and do the eyes and the nose real quick. As you see, this, once all the pieces are cut, this project does not take very long at all. So you just stick the dowel through a little bit, give yourself a mark, cut it off at the line real quick. I went ahead and cut the dowel for the eyes. I'm simply just going to take a Sharpie, black magic marker, color the ends. Now if you wanted to make this look real nice, you could have rounded this over with some sandpaper. Just do both ends real quickly. Not a big deal. Like I said, once the pieces are cut for this project, it goes together really quick. The only thing you gotta do is wait for some glue to dry here and there. But otherwise, this project is a quick project to make once all the pieces are cut. Okay. Just for grins, we'll take a little bit of dab of glue. Dab it just on the middle of the rod, just so the eyes won't fall out later on. Oh, Jam it in there. The best way to clamp this down is just with a piece of tape. Put a piece of tape on there, get your nose lined up, give a little pull, and there's enough pressure there to make sure that'll stay in place and get a nice glue up. And there we go, our nose and eyes are in place now. Now that the dog's head and plunger assembly is all together, we can go ahead and finish up with the moving parts. Just slide the rubber band on one side there, stick the head in the hole, put the rubber band there, and you're good to go. If you need to make that a little bit tighter, you can wrap that around a couple times. Okay, as you can see here, this is way too long, so now we go ahead and we want to be even with the end here and just draw a line 90 degrees to the plunger, and then we'll cut our waste piece off. Okay, our plunger is cut. We're just going to set the tail on here. Now that our plunger is cut, we need a 1/16 inch hole right up here in the corner and one right about here. I like to cut these, even though they are on the pattern, I like to cut them after the fact so that I can make sure that we got a clear straight piece from here to the tail. I'll go ahead and drill those out now. Now with the head forward, up like it's going to be with the rubber band on it, and the tail up against the stop here, we just simply take a paper clip, bend it over, making that turn as tight as possible, and we'll lay it over the other hole, put just a little mark on there, take a pair of pliers, give it another nice sharp 90-degree bend. You can go a little bit past 90, it's okay, because it'll actually help. It'll give it a little bit more spring tension in there. Now we've got our linkage connector. So we simply stick it in one hole, in the other hole, and push it down. Now you might have a problem when you put the cover on here, that the cover will bind down on that if it's too high. If that's the case, simply sand this area down and this area down to bring the paper clip a little bit lower. I'm probably going to have to do that here because I can see already that it's too high for the cover. So I'll do that real quick. As you can see, I sanded those down a little bit. Now our linkage is nice and tight, and we can simply test it real quick by slapping our side on and making sure everything moves freely. We're good to go. Just in case you're wondering, I just simply set these on the side of my belt sander. At this point, we're ready to put our side on. If you'll notice, I went ahead and just rounded over the edges a little bit. I just did that on a sander, so you give it a little bit of shape. If you notice, I went ahead and threw the ear on, both ears. That was real simple to do. You just take the one piece that we had that looked like this and just cut it in half. Very similar to what we did with the connecting rod. Just draw a line down the middle and cut it in half. Then you have two ears. Now we can go ahead and add our screws to the side of the body into our countersunk holes, which line up perfectly with the holes on the internal parts. Let's take a screwdriver and hook them down. You don't need to tighten them up hard at all. Just snug. Well, that's done. Now at this point we can try it out and make sure everything is going to come out okay. Literally. Whoops. Just throw a few in there. Load our little hole up. Just put a few in. Doesn't matter. You can load it up if you want. Put our cover on. Look at that. Everything's coming out properly. Now at this point, all that's left is getting the legs on. I'm just going to, cut dowels, insert the dowels into all 4 legs. And I'm going to round them over, shape them a little bit so they look nice and pretty. Okay, I've got the dowels in the legs. On this side, you don't want them to be permanently attached because you need to remove the legs in case it ever breaks. You need to be able to get the 2 screws out, so you don't want to glue these legs on. The other side, it's optional. You can glue them if you want, but you don't have to. It's the same thing. It's not going to hurt anything to glue them. It's not going to hurt anything not to glue them. And here our puppy is, standing up and doing his duty. Alright, so like I said, now I'm going to lacquer it and we're pretty much all finished. Okay, well here's our puppy, all pretty and lacquered up and shiny, and came out looking real nice. It's amazing what a couple coats of lacquer will do. If you have any questions, send me an email. It's right here. You can see it right there. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I would love to hear your comments. If you could, when you're done making this, let me know how the pattern worked out for you, how the video worked, how the written instructions work. If you have any suggestions of anything I need to change, I would really love to hear your input. So again, thank you for purchasing the pattern, and we'll see you on the next one.